Hi, my name is Rob Natelson, and I'll be your guide in this briefing on how the state legislatures can address the federal fiscal problems that Congress seems unable to address. I served many years as a law professor, taught constitutional law, and have done a lot of writing on the subject. I also have practical backgrounds as a lawyer and businessman. You can see the magnitude of the fiscal issues we face by turning your attention to the explosion in the federal debt. Debt, of course, is what happens when Congress doesn't balance its budget. Balancing the budget would seem to be a pretty basic thing to do. Households and state and local lawmakers do it every year. But in the 50 years from 1961 to 2011, Congress balanced its budget only twice. Naturally, people have suggested many ways to address the problem. One is political action, getting the right people elected and holding their feet to the fire. Obviously, though, this hasn't worked. Another solution often suggested is better education on the subject, and there's been no lack of reliable information about the federal government's financial problems. But although there's been plenty of education, it hasn't made much difference in Congress. There are just too many pressure groups who think that everyone else should take a cut, but that funding for their pet projects should be maintained or increased. Some people, both on the right and on the left, have suggested abolishing federal programs or handing them over to the states. But that hasn't happened either, because as the courts presently interpret the Constitution, there's no incentive for Congress to take that route. We've also seen many special commissions set up, most recently the Simpson-Bowles Deficit Reduction Commission, but their recommendations also have been ignored. And deficit reduction agreements, such as the late Graham-Rudman-Hollings Balanced Budget Act, or the so-called fiscal cliff, have been rescinded by Congress before they had sufficient effect. All this has led many to suggest that we need structural limits on Congress. What's a structural limit? It's a general rule that applies to government as a whole, not just on a particular issue. For example, we don't have an election every 2 years because Congress wants one. It's only because the Constitution imposes a structural limit by mandating elections every 2 years. The Constitution already puts a few other structural limits on congressional power, such as the rule that Congress can't tax exports. So why not add more? One popular idea for a structural limit is the straight balanced budget amendment, which would ban Congress from spending more in a given year than it takes in. It would be similar to the balanced budget rules that exist in 49 states. Although state legislatures sometimes bend those rules, almost everyone admits that they work better than having no balanced budget requirement at all. Another suggestion is sometimes called BBA Plus. This is a balanced budget amendment with rules added to protect citizens against abusive taxation. An example is an amendment requiring a 2/3 vote at both houses of Congress to raise taxes. Still another idea is the National Debt Relief Amendment, which would provide that Congress cannot get us further into debt without the approval of a majority of the state legislatures. Other proposals include a line item veto for the president, a single subject rule for congressional legislation, and an amendment allowing 2/3 of the states to repeal federal laws and regulations. But none of these ideas has become reality. Why so? Well, Congress doesn't like to restrain itself. And as I mentioned earlier, when it does adopt laws restraining itself, it usually repeals those laws fairly quickly. So any structural restraints have to be inserted into the Constitution as amendments where Congress can't repeal them. Well, how do we do that? One way a constitutional amendment could be submitted for ratification is for Congress to propose it. But how often does Congress propose amendments limiting its own power? The answer is that since proposing, how do I start? But how often does Congress propose amendments limiting its own power? The answer is that since proposing the Bill of Rights in 1789, except for the repeal of prohibition, Congress has never proposed an amendment limiting its own power. Many of the founders foresaw what is happening now. James Monroe, for example, warned that control freaks would flock to the national capital and try to concentrate all power there. And many founders warned specifically that Congress might abuse its authority. But many of them also saw the constitutional amendment process as a way to deal with that kind of abuse. Let me explain. Recall how the Constitution was drafted. It happened at a convention of delegations from 12 of the 13 states. The individual delegates were properly known as commissioners. During the convention, John Dickinson of Delaware, one of the most experienced and respected of the commissioners, wrote that we're not forming plans for a day, month, year, or age, but for eternity. He and others recognized that if you want a document to last for a very long time, you need to include a way it can be changed. So among the Constitution's 7 formal articles, the framers included Article 5, which provides for amendments. The founders believed constitutional amendments could serve several purposes. For one thing, they would enable Americans to respond to changed conditions. When advances in transportation allowed us to speed up the time between a federal election and the swearing-in ceremonies, we adopted the 20th Amendment, shortening that time. The founders also saw the amendments process as a way to correct drafting mistakes. For example, the original Constitution neglected to specify qualifications for the Vice President, so they were added by the 12th Amendment. The founders also believed that amendments would help resolve constitutional disputes. This has happened also. The 11th Amendment and the first clause of the 14th Amendment responded to arguments over constitutional interpretation. And finally, the founders believed that amendments could be passed to prevent or correct abuses. The Bill of Rights was adopted for this reason, and several other amendments were ratified to correct abuses by the states. But since the Bill of Rights, Congress has never proposed an amendment to correct its own abuses. Early in the Constitutional Convention, Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph introduced a proposal called the Virginia Plan. Among other items, the Virginia Plan suggested that the Constitution include an amendment procedure where the consent of Congress wasn't necessary. The convention debated the Virginia Plan and other proposals, and they passed resolutions that they submitted to a drafting committee called the Committee of Detail. It was chaired by South Carolina's John Rutledge. After about 2 weeks, the Committee of Detail presented a draft constitution. It provided for amendment by an interstate convention called by Congress at the demand of 2/3 of the states. The interstate convention would both write and approve amendments. While debating this language, several commissioners asked for changes. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts didn't want the same body both drafting and approving the amendments, so he won agreement that the Amendments Convention would send its proposals to the states for ratification. Alexander Hamilton successfully argued that Congress should be the body to propose amendments. But George Mason of Virginia insisted that since an abusive Congress might stand in the way of corrective amendments, they needed a way the states could bypass Congress. The convention again altered the amendment language to put Congress and the states on equal footing. An amendment could be proposed for state ratification either by Congress or by a convention of the states. It was James Madison who wrote what was essentially the final language of Article 5. Here is that language. It looks like a formidable block of type, doesn't it? But when you break it up, it becomes easier to understand. You can divide Article 5 into 3 parts. The first part allows either Congress or an interstate convention to propose amendments. The second part provides for ratification or rejection of the proposed amendments by state legislatures or state conventions. And the third part bans some kinds of amendments altogether. Notice another thing about Article 5. It empowers different assemblies or bodies of people to do different things. These assemblies include Congress, state legislatures, the Interstate Convention for proposing amendments, the state legislatures again, and conventions within individual states. Article 5 grants specific enumerated powers to each assembly. Here are the 4 kinds of assemblies again. Congress and the Interstate Convention act at the proposal stage, while state legislatures and state conventions act at the ratification stage. In addition, Congress gets to decide whether ratification will be by state legislatures or state conventions. Congress usually, but not always, opts for state legislatures. So let's go over the process again, step by step. First, Congress always has power to propose any amendment. It may do so by a vote of 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House. Once Congress proposes amendment, it then chooses what the Constitution calls a mode of ratification. That is, whether the amendment will be considered by the state legislatures or by special state conventions. For the 21st Amendment in 1933, repealing prohibition, Congress chose conventions. On other occasions, Congress has always opted for ratification by state legislatures. Incidentally, when Congress chose conventions for the 21st Amendment, there was a lot of foolish talk about how disastrous that might be, how conventions might take over the states or do other nefarious things. As it turned out, the entire process went on without a serious hitch. So all the assemblies empowered by Article 5 have used their power except one. Congress, state legislatures, and state conventions have all had a hand in the amendment process. Only one has not: the Convention for Proposing Amendments. Let's see how the convention process works. First, 2/3 of the state legislatures, that's 34 of the 50 states, adopt resolutions demanding a convention. Those resolutions are called applications. Congress must add them up. When there are 34 applications on any one topic, Congress must call a convention. Congress has no choice in the matter, and the courts may require it to act. Not surprisingly, some in Congress have tried to find ways to stop this method of wiring around Congress. A good example was the fear campaign waged in the 1960s by 2 liberal senators and their supporters, trying to block some conservative amendments. The senators were Joseph Tidings of Maryland and Robert Kennedy of New York. In congressional testimony, speeches, articles, and elsewhere, their supporters claimed that a convention for proposing amendments was a constitutional convention that could rewrite the Constitution, repeal the Bill of Rights, and restore slavery. Of course, this is nonsense. The convention meets under the authority of the Constitution and has no authority to rewrite it. The convention may only propose one or more amendments for consideration by the states. In one of the ironies of history, The fear campaign that was first widely publicized by some on the political left was later adopted by some on the political right. Legal writers have contributed to the confusion too, with convoluted legal theories that remind you of the old medieval arguments about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And some judges have muddied things by making guesses about Article 5 without ever doing any research on the subject. So let's clear away the debris and look again at what Article 5 tells us explicitly. The applications for a convention come from the state legislatures. When Congress finds that there are 34 on a particular subject, it must call a convention. The convention is to propose, not adopt, amendments, and certain amendments are off the table. You might ask why Article 5 doesn't give us more information. This is because the founders considered everything else to be obvious. How do we know this? Well, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. once pointed out that a page of history is worth a pound of logic. And the founders' history tells us other things we need to know about the convention. Americans in the 18th century already had used conventions a lot. They knew all about them. The term convention probably comes from the practices of the Presbyterian Church, where policy meetings were often called conventions. To our founders, a convention was a meeting other than a legislature convened to deal with one or more prescribed political issues. Today we might call such a meeting a task force or a conference. Some conventions met within only a single American colony or American state. But there were also diplomatic meetings among colonies or states and with sovereign Indian tribes. These meetings were interchangeably called congresses or conventions. At least 18 of these conventions or congresses were held during the lifetime of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin himself served as a delegate at 3 of them, and in his printing business, he published the official minutes of several others. Many other founders beside Franklin were veterans of conventions among the colonies and states. Here are some of the founders, in addition to Franklin, who attended the Constitutional Convention and who had also participated in earlier conventions among the colonies and states. On the screen is a list of 11 conventions held among the states after independence. As you can see, each was convened to address specific predetermined issues. Several other conventions were planned, but never held. The last one on this list was a proposed meeting of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland to suggest navigation improvements around Chesapeake Bay and the Susquehanna River. As you can see from this list, there are many types of conventions. A constitutional convention wrote the Constitution, but that document does not authorize another constitutional convention. It does authorize 3 other kinds. Conventions in each state to ratify or reject the Constitution. Conventions in each state to ratify or reject future amendments. And conventions among the states to propose amendments. The last is called a convention for proposing amendments. Many people have asked how the commissioners to such a meeting would be selected, what rules would be adopted, how voting would work, and so forth. These are the sorts of things the founders considered obvious. Take a short time to look at some of them. Now let's look at a few in greater detail. First, How are the delegates or commissioners chosen? Some people think Congress can decide this, but they are wrong. Actually, each state legislature decides how its own commissioners are selected. Since this is a diplomatic meeting of the state legislatures, each state delegation, or as it's called, committee, gets one vote. Some people have claimed that Congress gets to decide what the rules are. This also is wrong. Allowing Congress such power would undercut the whole purpose of the convention, to serve as a way the states can bypass Congress. Instead, each convention chooses its own officers and adopts its own rules. And because this is a diplomatic meeting among state legislatures, each legislature controls its own commissioners. The result of these procedures is that the states not only have the power to ratify, but through the convention device, they also have the power to propose. These procedures were well established when the founders adopted Article 5. After the Constitution was written, the people had to decide whether to approve it. There was a great public debate on the subject. Many people today misunderstand Article 5 because they've never read the records of that debate. But the participants in the debate made clear that a convention for proposing amendments is a tool by which the state legislatures can bypass Congress. Consider what was said by New York ratifier Samuel Jones. It could not be known to the framers of the Constitution whether there was too much power given by it or too little. They thereby prescribed a mode by which Congress might procure more if in the operation of the government it was found necessary, and they prescribed for the states a mode of restraining the powers of the government if upon trial it should be found they had given too much. Similarly, James Madison wrote, "The Constitution equally enables the general and the state governments to originate the amendment of errors, as they may be pointed out by the experience on one side or the other." And one of the greatest publicists for the Constitution, Tench Coxe, added, "It's been asserted that the new Constitution would be fixed and permanent and that no alterations or amendments could afterward be obtained. A candid consideration of the Constitution will show this to be a groundless remark. It is provided in the clearest words that Congress shall be obliged to call a convention on the applications of 2/3 of the legislatures, and that all amendments proposed by such convention are to be valid when approved by the conventions or legislatures of 3/4 of the states. It must be therefore evident to every candid man that 2/3 of the states can always procure a general convention for the purpose of amending the Constitution, and that 3/4 of them can introduce those amendments into the Constitution, although the President, the Senate, and Federal House of Representatives should be unanimously opposed to each and all of them." Also during the ratification debates, George Washington said that a constitutional door is open for such amendments as shall be thought necessary by 9 states. And Alexander Hamilton clarified that the states could require Congress to call a convention for proposing only one amendment. Further buttressing these statements are early resolutions on the subject by the state legislatures. And if all this were not enough, there is a wealth of evidence from the centuries after the founding that I haven't even mentioned, including a long string of decisions by the United States Supreme Court and many other courts. In conclusion, a convention for proposing amendments is a diplomatic meeting of state legislative delegations. State legislatures may apply for a convention unlimited as to subject matter or limited to one or more subjects. If 34 state legislatures apply, Congress must call the convention. If Congress refuses to carry out this duty, the courts may order Congress or its officers to do so. Each legislature decides how to choose its committee, and each legislature decides how to instruct it. At the convention, each state committee has one vote. Finally, if the convention does propose one or more amendments, Congress selects between two possible modes of ratification, either by state legislatures or by state ratification conventions. Only proposed amendments within the scope of the call can be considered for ratification. Can the states help the federal government solve its financial problems? Only time will tell. But the Constitution gives state legislatures a powerful procedure for correcting imbalances in our American constitutional system. As any founder would have said, it's not merely the prerogative of state lawmakers to exercise that power. When faced with a crisis of this magnitude, it is their duty.